It's French February, and that means it's a great excuse to buy a new model kit. But because I've got a rule where I can only buy something if I've built something else, that means I have to build this one straight away, right? Because I need to build it to justify buying it. So that's what I did. I bought it and I built it straight away. And I feel really bad because everything else in my stash is still sitting there. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and welcome back to the workbench as I build and review the HobbyBoss F8F-1B Bearcat in French Air Force colours. Let's get this one down onto the workbench. So I've not built that many HobbyBoss kits in the past, so I'm looking forward to having a go at this one. And as it's a Bearcat, I'm sure there's a particular modeler out there who'll be very excited to see this one. But without any further ado, let's get into this one. I'm going to put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. I have already done a full unboxing video on this particular kit, so for more details on the quality of the parts and what's included in the box, take a look at that one. As is quite normal, I'm going to start the build by cutting away all of the parts from the sprue and sanding down any rough areas. Fortunately, there isn't particularly a great deal of flash on this kit, so cleanup is an absolute minimum. And the first step to be completed was the assembly of the internal cockpit details. This kit does feature a number of smaller parts which need to be glued together. These include the rudder pedals, control column, pilot's chair, and some various control panels. I'm going to glue these all together now and then paint them in a little bit. The control panel does come with a clear part which needs to be glued in place, but there is a decal that goes on this and I'll deal with that a bit later as well. There is a rear bulkhead with the pilot's headrest on it, and this gets added onto the cockpit floor assembly. There is another bulkhead which needs to go at the front of the cockpit, and this holds different aspects and details such as these little reservoirs and mounting struts. They're not particularly visible in the finished model, but I added them nonetheless. There is a small tank which has to be assembled and then mounted onto the support struts. Just like when I did my Hellcat, I'm not entirely sure what this is for, but I think it's a water reservoir for engine injection. With that now mounted onto the cockpit part, I turned my attention to this other kind of firewall part. There are some other little details which need to be glued in here, and they are visible in the landing gear bays once this is completed. This assembly was then glued into its slots inside of the aircraft, and I turned my attention to the rear landing gear assembly. This comes in a couple of parts, with the rear landing gear being attached to this bulkhead component, and then this glued into the rear of the internal fuselage. There is another little brace part which needs to be glued into its slots as well. An arrestor hook can be glued in here, but it doesn't have any functionality, it just protrudes slightly from the rear of the aircraft. Now I'm going to turn my attention to assembling the engine details. This comes in a couple of parts which pretty much just lines up and snaps together. A little bit of glue was used to ensure a proper bond. I did have to make sure I got the orientation correct so that it wasn't upside down when it comes to be installed into the aircraft later. The final part to be assembled at this point are components which will go behind the pilot's headrest in the cockpit. And with that done, it was time to prime! So it's there, it's on my t-shirt. I've opted to go for my old faithful, which is the Humbrol No. 1 Matte Grey Primer. I quite like how this applies quite easily to the plastic parts and will allow any subsequent layers of paint to stick to it. And speaking of subsequent layers of paint, I've got this US Light Green from Model Air. This Vallejo paint was loaded into my airbrush and then airbrushed over all the internal areas of the cockpit, including all those assemblies which I've previously built up, the tail wheel area and the internal walls of the cockpit. I would use some Vallejo black to carefully pick out some of the details inside of the cockpit, such as on the control panel, control column, and other dials and switches. Humbrol 62, which is a matte leather colour, was carefully used on the headrest for the pilot. There is a small transfer for the control panel, and I found that the decal film protruded quite a bit around the outside, so I trimmed it to a more appropriate size. The decal had been soaked in warm water. The decal was slid into position, and then some more decal fix was used to stick it down onto the surface of the control panel. Once that was done and everything was dry, this cockpit assembly was glued into position inside of the aircraft. And now I can join the fuselage halves together. So far everything has fit together really nicely. There is a slight seam down the centre where the fuselage points join, so after having glued all of this together, this seam was sanded down with a fine sanding stick. I could have gone a little bit further, as I found that the seam was a little bit noticeable in the finished build. At this point I installed that little assembly which goes behind the pilot's headrest. And then I glued into place the reflector gun sight. This is made of two parts, one of them being a clear element, and these were painted appropriately in black off camera before being installed into the relevant place in front of the pilot. Sadly though, no pilot is included, so there will be no one to look through this reflector gun sight. After this, the tail surfaces were snapped into place and then bonded with a little glue. And I then turned my attention to the wing assemblies. So there are a couple of cannon barrels which need to be glued into their relevant slots, and you'll notice that there are some extra moulded marcations for other braces and things which can be included inside of the wings. This aircraft can have the wings folded if you want, but that does require modification. The parts to display the wings folded are included, but I decided I would have mine in the extended ready for flight option. With the wing surfaces now joined together, it was a simple matter to add them onto the aircraft. They were slotted into the relevant position and held in place until the glue had dried. I'm going to install the underwing pylons for the bombs, and it is worth noting that if you don't want to have them installed, you're going to have to fill those holes which are present for attaching them. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the cockpit canopy. I've decided to spend a little extra money and get an Eduard mask set for this kit. These pre-cut masks are a great way to ensure that the canopy framing is painted nice and neatly. It also speeds up this masking process, but naturally does cost a little extra. They were peeled from the backing sheets and then applied as appropriate to the relevant sections of the canopy. There are some areas that they don't quite cover though, so some Vallejo liquid mask was applied to those sections. A reasonably thick layer of this latex-based masking fluid would be applied and then left to dry. After this, some Humbrol clear fix was applied to the clear parts. It is a little stringy, so I have to be careful with the application not to make a mess, but it should dry clear and strong and not fog up the plastic. The clear parts were then carefully placed onto the aircraft in the correct position. I am pretty sure that if you wanted to, you could display the rear part of the canopy in an open position. I have decided though for ease that I will glue mine in the closed position. It will just make painting a lot easier. Moving on to the bottom of the aircraft, there are some extra components which need to be added onto the tail landing gear. And then I joined together the central drop tank. This comes in two halves which get glued together, with the mounting points then being glued into the correct holes on the top. The bombs come in a couple of parts as well, and these were glued together as appropriate. There are a number of rockets included, and all that needs to happen here is that the rear part of the rocket motor and fins gets glued onto the main body of the rocket. And now it's time to prime, again. So I'm just using the exact same primer that I've already used, but this time on everything that's either still waiting to be added onto the model, so the propeller, the engine cowling, the drop tank bombs and rockets, and all of the main landing gear components. I then turned my attention to the main assembly of the aircraft. In hindsight, I wish I'd used a finer grade of primer, because actually the Humbrol one is perfect for matte finishes, and also if you're hand painting, because if you're hand painting the paint just goes onto it so nice because it has a slightly grainy feel to it. But because this has a gloss finish later on, I find that this primer now is going to cause a little bit of a problem, but I'm sure we'll discuss that in a minute. The next paint I decided to use was this Humbrol number 11 Silver. There's not a great deal left inside of this can, but it will be enough just to use on the wheels. The wheels were sprayed with this colour, and then I will later on mask the hubs, as masking parts are included in the Eduard mask set. For the internal parts of the landing gear bays and the engine cowling, I'm using the same green colour which I used previously. Again, this was loaded into the airbrush and simply applied to those relevant areas. Of course, not forgetting that I do need to apply this to the internal areas of the landing gear bays. Hobbycraft matte black spray paint was then applied to the engine, the propeller, and the wheels. The wheels, as mentioned, having been masked so that the tyres in this case are now going to be black. Another rattle can is this 155 matte olive drab. This was applied to the bombs and the rockets. The rockets though don't need to stay this colour, they just need the tips in this colour. So I would mask the tips, and then using this Tamiya fine surface primer in white, paint the remainder of the body of the rockets. The tips should remain in the olive drab colour, whilst the body of the rockets is now going to be white. On the lower side of the aircraft, I masked up the landing gear bays, partly by using the main landing gear covers, but also extra bits of card cut to shape. I found the other parts didn't quite fit properly in a closed position. For the main colour of this aircraft, I'm going with this extra acrylics glossy blue, but I will thin it down a little bit with X20A Tamiya acrylic thinner, just to help it go through the airbrush. A number of thin coats of this would be used to build up the opacity, but it was a simple matter to spray this over the entire aircraft, and also any remaining elements that still required it, such as the external areas of the landing gear doors, the landing gear legs, and some other small components. And because it's a gloss blue, I don't need to apply a gloss coat, so it's time to move on to some decals. So you do actually get two decal schemes in this kit, and I've decided to go for the French one because it's French February. And you're probably thinking to yourself, but Matt, what is French February? Well, I think I'll hand over to Miss Modeller to quickly explain what it is before we progress with the build. Over to you.
French February. It's something I started a few years ago now and has evolved ever since. It started because I've always loved French aviation. Probably because in, I guess, popular culture in Britain, we don't really talk too much about the Battle of France and the French aviators that led the way for European aviation, or at least challenged some of the leaders of European aviation anyway. And I've always loved them. I think the first one I ever saw probably was the Deltline D520 when I was a kid, and I built the Frog kit, and I built it in Italian markings. But now, as an adult, I decided to spend 1 month a year dedicated to the unusual French subjects that we find ourselves with. I also do this in my Discord, so you can find the link for that in the description below. You can build anything, as long as it was either made in France or served in France. Whether it's a car, plane, ship, boat, tank, or I guess dioramas, infantry, whatever. As long as it's French in some way. That's the only rules. Just have fun. Anyone of any skill level is welcome. Right, I guess let's get back to your expected video, and hopefully you can go and subscribe to my channel too and see all the other people doing French February this year.
Well, thanks Miss Modeller for letting us know about French February, and if you want to get involved, I'm sure you can too. But back to the build. So we're looking at the decals at the moment, and I cut the decal sheet into more manageable sections. They were then soaked in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And as is quite typical, I'm going to use microscale, microset and sol as my setting solutions. First up, microset from the blue bottle was painted onto the relevant areas where the transfers were going to be applied. The decals were then slid into position and carefully manipulated so that they were in the right places. Further coats of microset could be used to soften the decals into the surface of the model. The decal application process was actually relatively straightforward. I did have some apprehension about the decals as they did look a little bit flaky and papery, but actually they applied onto the model really well. And with repeated applications of microset, and then later once they'd started to settle, microsol, they actually settled into the surface details amazingly well. The general application of the transfers is straightforward, but I did find that the number of little stencils and things was a little bit tedious. There are quite a few little stencils included, and some of them aren't particularly legible, which is a bit of a shame given the scale of this kit. I've had smaller scale kits with finer printing on the transfers from other manufacturers, but the quality of the decals in this kit was acceptable. With those decals now applied and settled onto the surface of the plastic, I loaded some Humbrol clear gloss varnish into my airbrush and then applied it to the entire aircraft. I would build up a couple of coats of this all over the aircraft for two reasons. The first one is to give a uniform finish and protect those decals, as the decals have a slightly different sheen to them, and I want it to look the same as the rest of the aircraft. Protecting them is going to mean that any weathering I do is not going to destroy them. As mentioned previously, the second reason is because that primer that I used is a little bit grainy, it's a little bit lumpy, and what this gloss I'm hoping is going to do is try and smooth it all out. But in the end it did work okay, but it doesn't quite solve it. I wish I'd used a finer grade primer, as the gloss effect is lost a little bit in this build. I would use some Vallejo aluminium paint to pick out the centre of the propeller, and then I would dry brush it onto the engine to pick out those details as well. Sticking with the engine, I'm going to use this Humbrol number 165 medium sea grey for the central part of it. A couple of thin coats would be applied here to get a reasonably even coverage. I then turned my attention to using some Vallejo white on the support struts of the rear landing gear. Returning back to the propeller, I'm going to use some Humbrol number 99, which is a lemon colour, on the tips, which marks out where the dangerous spinny bits are. This was simply done by hand, taking time and care to get a straight line. Now I'm going to return back to the landing gear bays. I carefully removed the masks that were in there and did need to touch up a few little areas with some paint. Before I add the landing gear, I'm going to use some of this SMS dark brown enamel based wash. I'll actually thin it down with some white spirit to make it flow a little bit better and make the effect look a little more subtle. This was simply painted onto all of the various elements of the model. It is my intention that this should add some dirt and grime and a bit of contrast. In particular, I left it quite heavily on the engine and the landing gear bays, but I would also apply it to the propeller, the wheels, after having removed the masks of course, and the entire aircraft assembly. This was applied over the entire aircraft, and my hope is that it will run into all those recessed panel lines and details. I didn't want the effect to be too heavy though, so when it was a little bit dry, I would remove excess wash in the direction of airflow using a cotton bud soaked in white spirit. When that was done, it was time to assemble the landing gear legs. This is a relatively straightforward process, with the landing gear leg being glued into position on the wheel, and you'll see that I've already picked out some elements in silver, and then the main landing gear leg is glued onto its mount on the door. This is then attached in the correct holes inside of the landing gear bay, and then a couple more support struts are glued into their relevant holes and positions as well. This was a little bit fiddly, and at one point I even thought I'd lost one of these parts, but it turns out it was just hiding. I then made sure to remember to install the open landing gear doors, and then I mounted the engine into position on the front of the aircraft. The cowling, which had only been sort of placed onto the aircraft, was then properly glued on. The drop tank on the centre line of the aircraft was then glued into its relevant holes, and this was followed by installing the bombs on the pylons on the wings. The rockets could then also be installed, and I kind of wish I'd put the rockets on first, then the bombs, as it was a little bit fiddly this way round, but it is possible to do. I carefully peeled away the canopy masks, and they seem to have done a really good job of keeping the canopy nice and clear of any errant paint. And there are a couple of clear parts which need to go on the tips of the wings. I have painted one wingtip with a green navigation-like colour, and the other one in red. Some gunmetal grey was then used to pick out some elements of the kit, including the cannon barrels and engine exhausts. A little product I was given to try out a little while ago is this aging powders pack. I decided I would use the smoke pigment to depict engine exhaust and a little around the gun ports, applying it onto a dry brush and then streaking it rearwards in the direction of airflow would help give a representation of the effect. I then attached the propeller onto the nose of the aircraft, and I thought that at this point this kit was done. However, I realised that I had dropped the model rather carelessly a little bit earlier on, and one of the cannon barrels had actually gone missing. I decided to make a replacement out of some stretched sprue. So this was added into the right place, and then given a coat of gunmetal grey just to blend it in and make it look not so apparent that it's a replacement part. And with that, I'm calling my build of the HobbyBoss Bearcat in 1/48 scale complete. So actually, this was a really fun kit to build. I like this one because everything just fits together. There are some small little areas when you look through the kit and you think to yourself, oh Matt, you didn't quite address that, or that's not quite right. And yes, there is a bit of a seam down the centre line of the aircraft on the top and on the bottom. I could have maybe added a bit of filler. I didn't really realise it at the time. It's maybe a little bit more proud because I've got gloss varnish on there. I could have spent more time addressing that. But everything else, like I didn't use any filler for the rest of the build, everything else just sort of fits, everything just sort of works. It's one of these kits that I just really enjoyed building. One small little error that I may have caused myself, I don't know why or how, but on the inside of the cockpit canopy there is an ever so slight bit of fogging. I wonder if maybe when I attached the clear parts there was something in there that wasn't quite dry, maybe some cement wasn't quite dry, and that's fumes have sort of acted in there. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but I maybe just need to slow down a little bit. Some of these mistakes here are partly due to the fact that this kit was so nice to build, I just flew through it. So yeah, maybe slowing down, just taking things a little bit slower. I did, looking in my book, it took me 3 days, but obviously I was working at the time, so it was around. So when I got going on it, things were happening quickly. Another thing, and this is the main thing that I don't like about this kit, is my choice of primer. The primer, as mentioned, is a bit grainy, a little bit large. Great for hand painting, but not so great for a gloss varnish. I have applied gloss over it a number of times, but the paint isn't as smooth on the surface, and you can see a sort of it's like a speckly kind of look to the varnish, which if I were to do this again, I would probably use like a Tamiya fine surface primer so that I would try and avoid this. So that's a lesson learned. Definitely would consider building another kit like this from the HobbyBoss range if they are all this simple and fun to build. Things that I don't really like about this kit, as mentioned, the printing of the decals is not as refined as other companies. The small text isn't particularly legible, but the transfers themselves are printed to a reasonable quality and actually apply to the kit really nicely. You do get 2 different paint schemes in this kit, one for a Thai Air Force version or one for the French one, which I've done for French February. I found that extra acrylics paint to be absolutely fine to use as well, and those Edouard masks were a good decision because it made that step of masking the canopy so much easier. Another thing perhaps we need to mention about the canopy, which I picked out in my unboxing, is there's a seam down the back of the main canopy sort of bubble, which is left over from the moulding process, which is a bit frustrating. I didn't bother to address it in my build, but I'm sure that people out there who aren't happy with it may need to sand and polish that. But to be honest, I don't really notice it, so I'm quite happy to leave it as it is. But when you do spot it, it does detract from the appearance a little bit. So talking about this kit, this is actually a 2011 tooling, and that surprised me given the kind of quality of the parts and how everything just fits together so well. And that was the thing that got me about this kit, was just how well everything fits together. The detail level is really quite good as well, featuring recessed panel lines and rivets and other small details which I wasn't expecting to see. The version I've got here though I think dates from 2017, so it's a slightly later release, but nonetheless is still pretty good when you compare it to current standards that we expect from model kits. So how much did I pay for this one? Well, I think I paid £23.50 for it, which if I look online, the price for this seems to vary between £20 and £25 at the time I'm making the video, which is, so the price I paid is kind of just straight down the middle, which seems absolutely okay and is in line with 1/48 scale kits of this kind of size and quality from other manufacturers. All of this information, of course, I'm just double checking against what's in my little journal. This is actually my second journal. I've had to start because I filled up my previous one from last year. And yeah, in here, if you want to get one of these for yourself, the links are in the description. I wrote these specifically to help people keep a track of what they're doing, and you just sort of log everything that you're doing in there. But I don't think I missed anything other than that thing where I broke a cannon barrel. I dropped it. I was messing around with it. I don't know what I was doing. I dropped it. And I went, oh, it's all fine, picked it up and moved on. But I must have snapped a cannon barrel because I don't know where that's gone. So I had to make a replacement for it. So a little bit annoying that the errors, the mistakes, the majority of the problems with this kit were caused by myself and my own incompetence. But yeah, I think that is pretty much it. So for my final build for French February, I hope you've enjoyed this one. And Moz, if you're watching, this is a Bearcat for you. And I hope I did an okay job of it. All in, this was a pretty decent kit, and I could be tempted to get something else like this from the HobbyBoss range again in the future. And with that, I'm going to leave it here. As always, quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen. And if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, take a look at the links in the description. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and from me here on the workbench, I will see you all again next time. What am I doing? HobbyBoss Bearcat. Yeah, take one. Yeah, let's take one. What am I doing? Bearcat. Right, where are you? Where are you? Where have I put that? I decided I was you. The general paint scheme for this kit is the general decal. I decided to make a replacement out of some stretched